Angel Fire. Today I have with me Instagram page owner LILIKOI.WAV. They make a variety of audio visual collages on Instagram, and I really love their work since I found them. So my first question, of course, always is, how did you get into this? What was your background, and what made you think, like, I really want to pursue this graphic design thing?
So that's actually a good question. As far as getting into it, I've been doing graphic design since I was little. I don't know if you know the program Corel Paint Shop Pro, I think it's called. Have you ever heard of that program? But I got started in like middle school editing pictures and doing graphic design with that, which is a lot of the stuff that I made was really bad. I think still to this day, a lot of the stuff that I make is still probably not the best, but I got my start in middle school doing graphic design. I've always been interested in art. Later on in middle school, actually, I also joined a punk band too, which made me also start to get interested in music as far as like a music creator. So yeah, I think the big thing with graphic design was just trying to create kind of like my own world or my own version of my world. I had lived in the Philippines for a while, and then I moved back to the US, and that transition was really kind of difficult for me when I was younger. I think going from like the city in Manila to moving to like really boring, just kind of like the most standard vanilla suburbs of the United States, was really hard. So I had to use my imagination a lot, and a lot of the things that got me first interested in design was just kind of like the advertisements that I saw when I was living in Southeast Asia, and then a lot of the graphic design that went into a lot of video games and stuff that I played to kind of escape the mundane reality that I was dealing with.
How old were you when you came to the United States?
So I was born in the United States. My dad worked for the U.S. government, and so part of the reason that we went to the Philippines was because he was working for the embassy at the time. And so when I was about, I think it was right before I turned 7, we moved to the Philippines. And then 2 years later, when I was like 9, we moved back to the U.S. And we moved to the Southeast. And a lot of the stereotypes aren't true about the Southeast, but it's not the most like diverse place in the world, especially the place that we were living, which was like suburbs south of Atlanta.
Yeah, I spent a vacation out in Thailand, and I feel like there's probably a lot of overlap with the aesthetics throughout Southeast Asia.
But yeah, at the time too, there was a lot of, I mean, Japan soft power. It was around the turn of the millennium, so very formative years, especially for like the aesthetic right now. Late 90s, early Y2K era, and there was a lot of anime and a lot of Japanese design everywhere. There's a lot of Japanese companies that have offices in the Philippines and were expanding in the Philippines at that time. And so I was able to soak up a lot more Japanese culture than a lot of people in my generation. But I mean, that's not saying too much, because a lot of people around my age, which is like my mid-20s, with Toonami and things like that, got a lot of Japanese influence.
I find it quite interesting that Japan became such an epicenter of Y2K design because, I mean, all this, like, kind of techno music that, your page has a lot of that kind of dance, whatever you want to call it. I wouldn't really call it EDM, but I guess it technically is. Japan kind of became the epicenter for a lot of this very electronic music, and it's quite interesting because that all started here in the US and then went over to Britain and got like really huge over there with breakbeat hardcore, and like the whole raver look started to form.
Yeah, it is interesting. I wish I could have been here for like the 90s and early 2000s. So I feel like it was a really interesting time in Japan. I'd say culturally, a lot of things seem to, and I know everyone's always more critical of the present than they are of the past, but I'd say culturally, I feel like Japan has kind of slowed down in some ways.
Oh yeah, yeah,
I think
definitely.
Yeah, and so what Japan was doing in the 90s, late 80s, obviously that led to the whole like city pop, and it led to a lot of what's being used in whatever we're going to end up calling post vaporwave. But I would say the 2000s, the early 2000s were really interesting, just as far as like the counterculture and the media that was coming out was very kind. I don't know how much you know about Japanese history. I don't know a ton, but in modern history, they had that whole bubble, their .com bubble, that happened in the early 90s, and so they had this huge recession. I want to say in the early to mid 90s in Japan, and so you had this kind of countercultural revolution come up of these really interesting artists that kind of hit their peak. I feel like the early 2000s, and you can see it in a lot of the art. I mean, I'd say even like Takashi Murakami, who's like the really big name that a lot of people would recognize. I feel like he's kind of influenced by this, like, I don't want to grow up, I don't want to be like a typical worker, and I just kind of want to like embrace fantasy. And I feel like that's something that kind of resonates with a lot of Americans at this point, post American recession. It definitely does for me, especially like paired with a lot of the imagery that I'm used to, like from my childhood of like 90s retrofuturism.
What I remember from like the late 90s, it wasn't really, I mean, it wasn't really as big as, like media now that we can cherry pick and say, yeah, that looks very Y2K, but like it was just one of many kind of aesthetics. I feel like, I don't know, maybe it will come back in a new form and even bigger than it was before. I don't know.
Yeah, I would agree. It's a fair take. I think like our vision of the past is constantly changing in the same way that like our vision of the future. We look at things like from the 80s, imagining the future. One of my coworkers was talking to me about Back to the Future, and just like, when you think about that movie and what their vision, I guess it was the second one where they go into the future. Yeah, just that vision of the future. Yeah, it's kind of funny to laugh at what's like everything that's so wrong, but it's also interesting to kind of like, it's such a reflection on the time period. And I think for the 90s and the early 2000s, it's the exact same way. I don't know if you ever had the opportunity to watch Xenon or Xenon the Sequel channel original movie. Oh yeah, their vision of the future, beautiful.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is interesting to see like what we imagine the future is going to be like. And I think I want to say the late 90s were definitely kind of this, I think we'd gotten over kind of like the super harsh cyberpunk that we had in like the early 90s and the late 80s, and we were kind of looking at the future and imagining. I think we were really excited. I don't know if a lot of that panned out. But I think with my art, sorry to go off on a tangent, but I think with my art, I would like to kind of recapture that imagination of the future, not corporate suckfest.
I think what really, you start to see the genesis of the year 2000 style kind of emerging from cyberpunk and a lot of other styles. It films like Hackers comes to mind, that it's like you can see elements of late 80s cyberpunk, but you can see it's kind of transitioning. Terminator's another one. I think Terminator 2, you could see that too.
Yeah, I'd say Hackers probably had a really big influence. I think also just because of the kind of like the imagination that went into it. because especially, I mean, like a lot of the hacking scenes and stuff like that, there's so much CGI and the things that they do to help you visualize what's going on when the hackers are hacking into these like terminals and stuff like that. I have very little technical knowledge, but I think there was a lot of imagination about like what the internet could be. And I think for a lot of people around our age, it's kind of cute and it's kind of beautiful to look back on that time and be like, hey, wow, this is the time that we imagined that like the internet could empower people and bring people together and create a better future, maybe. I know it's done that in some ways, but you know, the reality is never as pretty as what you imagine. So
More mundane.
yeah, definitely. I I think social media caught people off guard. Just the way that it inhabits our life and the way that we inhabit it, the mundane realities of life, kind of made immortal through Facebook and everything else. You know, looking at people having kids, buying houses, and I'm a little bit later on in life, maybe a few years later on, but it's crazy. You just get these like waves of people growing up in very mundane ways. No offense to them. I think, you know, if you can find happiness in that, that's great. But it is interesting. It's not the like chrome and holograms and lasers that we were expecting. But I guess it's futuristic in its own way. It's easy to take things for granted when you're actually like dealing with them, I guess.
Yeah. Subcultures on the internet have changed quite a lot from the late 90s. Back that time, there was not a lot of heavy cataloging by a service like Google. People kind of were in these small, tight-knit communities and felt like they were occupying these digital enclaves. There was very much, I think, a sense that, you know, this was the future.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. I feel like those people probably felt like they were on the bleeding edge of what was going to be the future. And I think it's easier to appreciate that when you're in a smaller group. I would say even within a lot of the design and creative communities online right now, with some of the aesthetics that are going on, I feel like there are a lot of people who really feel like they're bringing something new and really interesting. I know a lot of my stuff is inspired by the past, so it's hard to group myself in there with those people. For example, like PC music and a lot of the artists that work with PC music, they're doing something that's really interesting, and even if they're inspired by a lot of bubblegum pop of the 90s and a lot of the aesthetics of the 90s, they've consistently done a pretty good job of providing something that also feels new. That's something that I would like to also accomplish. I don't know how successful I am, but it's something that's my goal when I create art is to not just kind of rehash what I've already lived through. I know that's kind of only relevant to me, but also kind of create a vision of the future and also not create like a super negative vision of the future. I feel like my generation especially has really kind of, I think just because of what we've been through, I just feel like the future is going to suck. Like, at least in my imagination, for my art to not add more negativity to what we think is going to be.
Yeah, I mean, for most of my life, I've seen this trend towards kind of a pessimistic future, and I don't know when exactly it started, but I think that, you know, it's not just totally based on alarmism. There's concerning things going on in the world, but I feel it's just too easy to kind of just throw your hands up in the air, just kind of complain or make art that effectively does that. But, you know, I prefer to try and challenge myself to find the good qualities and magnify those qualities and bring those qualities out in art and music. And I think, there is a quality, a positive feeling that is created from this kind of, futuristic looking design. And I enjoy that kind of outlook, even if it is obviously naive.
It's interesting that you say that because I feel like even I have an older brother who's about 3 years older than me, and it's interesting seeing like the generational differences just within 3 years. I would say I think I'm maybe three years older than you, because I feel like generally speaking, people my age have a very kind of negative view, but I would say staggered 3 years, people who are maybe 3 years younger than me seem to be a lot more positive. I think that's something that I really like about. I don't know if you'd be considered Gen Z. I don't think you would be. It's kind of a gradient, obviously, but Gen Z is so much more positive than a lot of kind of like my second half of the millennial generation. I'd say when I create art, that's actually something that I feel definitely inspires me. It's just seeing people being excited about the future again, because I feel like culturally, at least in the U.S., people, post 9/11 and post invasion of basically all of the Middle East, um,
Yeah.
we had a really negative view of what the future was going to be. The U.S. became more clearly a surveillance state, and we had all these things going on where we were just like, oh man, this is awful. Then the recession hit, and it was just like, even though I think a lot of people, especially my age, weren't able to feel the full weight of it because we were still in school, but it just what that does to your psyche as you're growing up, it just makes you kind of feel like really negative about what your opportunities are going to be. But like looking at a lot of the art and a lot of the messages coming out of Gen Z and generations coming after them is really inspiring, and I feel like I get a lot of my energy from seeing what people are doing who are a lot younger than me, because I think they have the right attitude. It's cool. It's really cool to see what other people are creating, especially people who are like so much younger than me.
Right. Sorry to interrupt you there, but I just learned a guest we've had on the show before, U7 or Alex. He is actually going to be able to come on here and join us for a little bit, as well as ask some questions. So I just want to welcome Alex on.
Wait, are you the sorry to get meta, but are you the is your username on Instagram a lot of O's and then
Yes, indeed, I am.
ah forever obscure? I love it. Thank you. Thank you for coming. I like your stuff.
I like your stuff a lot as well.
Thank you. It means a lot.
In fact, our gracious podcast host a couple days ago showed me your page.
Oh, really?
I'm gonna be honest, I didn't know. I didn't know who you were at the time, but you make very, very good content. I'm glad he showed me your page.
Thanks so much. I feel like I don't spend much time promoting my page because I still feel like I'm kind of in like this like research and development stage right now, which is maybe like a lot of my creative process. But it's nice to hear that people are resonating and sharing my work. It's really cool whenever I get comments or hear that people have appreciated something that I'm doing. I tend to feel like a lot of times when I'm creating, I'm just kind of creating just kind of for myself. I don't have a ton of followers, so it's cool when it resonates with anybody else. That's awesome. Thank you. You make art, right?
Right. All the stuff on my page is OC.
Yeah. What do you use? What's your process, if you don't mind me asking? Sorry to turn the interview on its head. I'm now the
Oh
interviewer.
no. Funnily enough, I don't use any computer programs. Everything I use is an app that you can find on the Google Play Store.
Oh, cool.
Um, yeah, I've wanted to like branch out because looking at your work, it looks like a majority of it would be computer based on the graphical intensity and complexity of the pieces. Um, what exact like so what I'm trying to get at is mostly I use stuff like Chroma Lab and Mirror Lab and a bunch of really interesting photo editing softwares.
Yeah. So
Um,
like apps on your phone. That's actually how I
yeah,
got started too.
yeah. What exactly did you use?
So back in the day, maybe, oh man, maybe 5 years ago, I started making art just using my phone, and then I stopped for a bit. I think actually, if you scroll far enough back on my account, I have stuff posted from then. And then maybe like 2 years ago, when I moved to Japan, I started
Mm-hmm.
making art again. I just felt more inspired being here, and wanted to kind of get back into the scene of posting things, posting art. The apps that I use are iOS apps, but
Ah,
if you know Glitch,
I've heard of it.
uh, you've heard of it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that app was a big one. I'd say another one that people don't know as much about is an app on the iOS store called Matter, and I would imagine that it's also available for the Google Play store also. But
Mm-hmm.
that one's a big one. And then there was an overlay, but I used that to kind of composite everything using
Right.
like chroma keying and stuff like that. So if you go
Right.
far enough back, a lot of my stuff is actually very kind of lo-fi
Yeah.
and more of a kind of more of a collage. But
I'm getting that vibe.
yeah, if you scroll maybe like it was around a year ago that I changed, and actually changed out of necessity. um,
Mm-hmm.
on my Instagram account, I had done like a hashtag for virtual self, and then they
Yeah.
reached out to me, or not them, not Porter Robinson, who's behind the that project, but his one of the people on his management team to do some for his live show, and so I was like, oh shit, everything I do is so, I mean, the aspect ratio on them is not going to be enough for like a screen playing behind someone on a live show. So I had
Right.
to change out of necessity, which was nice. It was really cool to have that excuse to upgrade.
Hmm.
But yeah, I can definitely recommend you some programs to start messing around with. uh, I feel like the industry standard is always like Adobe programs, which I'm sure are really good. I use open source software
I
Um,
have dabbled with Adobe. The thing is, and I'll admit this now, I never pay for them. I just keep making new fake emails to keep getting free trials on
word.
Adobe products.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm not gonna waste money on that.
Yeah, I don't have the money to keep
Yes,
paying monthly. I definitely understand why they do that, but it kind of sucks. And so I can't fault you for making thousands of emails to maintain your creative endeavors. That's where it's at.
one thing I feel the need to address looking through your page is you have a very tasteful use of color palettes, and you're very diverse with them. Noticing like a shift between like mainly green or teal based projects to orange to purple to more light blues and whites. It's very well done. It's very masterful.
Thank you. Um, yeah, I would say I've always appreciated Instagram accounts that try to keep a similar color scheme or using complementary color schemes throughout their feed. So when you scroll
Hmm.
through, it kind of all seems to match. I generally use kind of like a certain spectrum of the color wheel, going from like maybe kind of pastel pinks to pastel blues.
Hmm.
Recently, I've been using more of the kind of like neon green or lime green color scheme, and kind of like a bright orange sometimes.
Hmm.
I do feel like I need to diversify sometimes. There's something about those colors, especially pastel colors in general, just psychologically, they resonate with me a lot more than basically anything else. But I do try to kind of plan out what colors I'm going to use. Sometimes if there's like a random shift throughout the feed, it's usually because I feel like the colors that I'm using aren't serving whatever art I'm doing at the time, and I need to shift to something else. But
Hmm.
I try to keep the. I know it's kind of a dumb thing to do, especially for an account that's as small as mine. But I try to keep them consistent or look like they go together.
Right.
Like TLC colors, you know.
Oh god, that's beautiful. Speaking of TLC, I know I mentioned PC music, and there's something I'm just curious. When PC music started, there was a project, and I don't know what producer was actually behind this project, but they only, as far as I know, only released like one song, and it was called Palette,
Yeah.
and it was by an artist called TLC, but it's like spelled out, so it's I think TIELSIE. Are you familiar with that song? A lot of people aren't, but curious because that song, as far as like influences go, I really love that song. It's just,
What genre would you classify it as?
oh man, I kind of just out of convenience, I classify most PC music stuff as bubblegum based.
Yeah.
I don't know what the right term would be. I feel like it's definitely kind of hard trance inspired.
Hmm.
I don't know who's behind it, and I really wish I did because it's a really cool song, and there's no other music under title TLC. Maybe I've just kind of hyped it up in my brain, and so
Yeah.
you always feel self conscious when you share other songs with other people. But to me, it was just there's a lot of really cool concepts in this song that I feel like deserve to be appreciated. I want to say probably A.G. Cook or Danny Elharl probably had a hand in this, but I can't say for certain.
Yeah.
I'm sure if I researched more, I might be able to tell. But
I think that QT song was like one of the earliest examples of Y2K revival. I mean, I guess outside of little image collages, people like James Farrar was doing. QT definitely had that kind of thing going on.
Yeah, that's actually what that's how I found was actually that song. Love that song.
I feel like it got really popular for a second, and it's weird because I think I even knew PC music was. Somehow I remember seeing that, and I don't remember how I found it, or you know.
The way I found it was I was working at a store at the time, and that was on the playlist, and I was like, "What is this song? The song is amazing." Which is very, just that song is very hyper. The vocals are shifted up, and it's just this very kind of euphoric and chaotic song. And I was like, I want to make music like this. I really like this. I think probably because it was Sophie's song, right? Sophie produced that, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I'd say a lot of the stuff on PC music has a lot of, I would imagine, similar influences to a lot of the stuff that I listened to growing up.
Yeah, yeah. Just kind of to segue out to a different topic. There's one illustrator, and I wouldn't necessarily say that your work looks like his, but I feel like the style of the collage, nature of your work, kind of reminds me of this artist, David Rudnick. Not sure if you're familiar with him.
David Rudnick.
Where's he based out of? And he's a current artist, right? He's continually putting
Visual
stuff out,
artist.
right? I'm actually not familiar, but that is one thing that I will say about me is that I'm not as familiar with a lot of like the scene. I think part of it is probably a fault of my own laziness of not like constantly like looking up and seeing who the new or who the main artists are going on. But just looking at his page and stuff that he makes, this is definitely the stuff. Either people probably inspired by him, or maybe even his stuff getting reposted is probably something that I've seen and has affected me. I can't. There's a rave magazine from Germany in the 90s, and I want to say it's pretty well known. But that's something that I've also been going to for inspiration. Yeah, all this stuff looks like rave posters of raves that I wish I could have attended when I was 3 years old. Yeah, this is beautiful. I think that's something that kind of frustrates me about Instagram. Kind of, I don't know, alternative internet art scene right now is that artists aren't credited. I'm not really worried for me. My stuff doesn't really get reposted, but there's a lot of art that I really wish like I knew who the originator was. Even like photography, where it's like done on. It's like a cell phone photo that was taken probably in like 2006, and I'm just like, where did this come from? What is the like who originally posted this, and how did you find this? It's stuff that is really fascinating to me. I didn't finish it, but you guys had an interview with someone who does like Instagram, kind of like he runs a kind of collage account.
Oh, debug.
Yes, it's really interesting. Really interesting. Had to stop because I was getting to work, but I was like halfway in. It's just really interesting because that's something that I think traditionally I'd kind of turn my nose up at people who kind of repost art, but I think it's really important. It's something that I undervalued when I was younger, but now looking back, you definitely need people like that to create kind of a cohesive theme and cohesive
and like
kind of movement.
You know, too, is that in the medium of collage, you kind of develop an understanding of aesthetics, and to one day maybe turn that into actually creating art.
Yeah, I think those people are very important. They're almost in some ways kind of like instructors or textbooks for a lot of the artists that will come in the future. And so I think they are really, really important. I think part of the reason that I knocked them when I was younger was this idea that like art had to be very original. And that if you're just reposting art, that's not true art. But I think as I've gotten older, I've realized that the creation process isn't just coming from like a single artist, and art is a lot more about context than it is about really anything else. And I think for a lot of people who maybe didn't necessarily grow up during the 80s or early 90s, or were even involved in like listening to music much back then, when we hear this music, we're like, oh, that's the 80s. Oh, that's the 90s, because it fits our image. The reason why it fits our image is because it's a very kind of algorithmic in the way that they created it. You know, it's very kind of like you add these influences together and then you've got your song.
Yeah.
Which nothing against it. I mean, I'd say as far as 80s, city pop is beautiful. Just going and listening to some of the songs and rabbit holing through those. They're really, really great. But I think if I was an artist in the 80s, I'd be like, this stuff is just utter trash. Like this is just, you know, it's probably like the equivalent of beach house music maybe a few years ago. Where it's just so super saturated. It's just using the same sounds that every major producer is using. There's not any necessary innovation going on. But I think the more I experience things like that, the more and more I appreciate them, because I think they do serve a really important role. And it's not always about originality. And I think we also have to accept that originality is kind of a moving target, and it's not something that anyone can actually accomplish.
I think the term originality itself is a bit of a slippery slope to go on, because the purpose of art, well, it's that itself is a controversial phrase, the purpose of art. But the purpose of art is to inhabit both ourselves and to reflect the world we see. And that is, in a sense, a form of mime. So creating something original has to be a reflection of something, a model based on something else. And I think that over the course of the last 30 or so years, with a pretty substantial boom in the amount of popular culture that the Western world is consuming, you see people struggling with that idea of originality much more, and where the new frontiers lie for creative artists.
Yes, 100%. I feel like that is something that has changed, and I think in the past 10 years has become especially a lot more, or people have become a lot more aware of that reality, which is just that like art is not really this truly original thing that is coming out of some person who has been given this amazing talent. We put people on pedestals way too much, and I think that's changing. I think the fact that social media in a lot of ways has made people realize that like every individual person is simultaneously a lot more important and a lot less important than we originally thought. As far as artists go, we've realized that like a lot of artists are just regular people who are just living regular lives, who create good art sometimes and really boring art other times.
Yeah.
And then also seeing, you know, like there's someone I follow who I want to say is like 15 or something, and they post pictures and make kind of collage art in Manila, and the stuff that they make is like really, really good. And if they had more of a platform, you know, like they could be this huge account. It's just all about kind of the mythos that we create around artists that makes one artist seem like they're so amazing and the other artists seem like, oh, it's just a random kid making art. You know, if you change the context, more people would appreciate it.
It's a certain amount of how you portray your character as well, and I know every person has a different way of portraying that sort of character. When you interact with people on your account, whether they're just asking you, you know, what kind of software do you use, or complimenting your stuff, like, is there a character that you try to portray in that scenario?
Oh, I really like that question. I would say kind of, but in addition to that, like I feel like every social role that I play is in some way kind of a character. I know it's kind of, I don't know, dodging the question, but I would say who I am to different people definitely changes. That's not a novel idea in any way, but
Right.
I think that social media and Instagram and different accounts, especially because this account isn't necessarily tied to who I am directly. You know, I don't post pictures of myself, and I don't specify like my gender on the account. Like I try to keep that stuff more vague. Obviously, probably a male based on my voice, right? But the I like that I can be someone unique to that account. You know, like that, like my interactions with people. At least the way that I feel about it is that that's part of the art of the account. It's just interacting with people in a way that I feel is consistent with my art. I think I do that socially. I was actually talking to someone of how my interactions change based on the people that I talk to, especially, for example, like living in Japan. I interact with Japanese people in a way that at least I feel is maybe more influenced by Japanese social norms than the culture that I grew up in. And I think people are a lot more malleable and a lot more fluid than we give ourselves or each other credit for. So I think my Instagram account definitely reflects that. Though I feel like in some ways my Instagram account is probably more true to myself than the way that I interact with just a random stranger on the street. So
Right. It gives you, I think, at least in my personal experience, more of a purpose to put your best foot forward, in that there is a certain level of freedom that comes with the anonymity of the
yeah,
account, a bit more free reign to, if one was to be so bold, make controversial statements, or it's a good place to test throwing a bunch of shit on a wall and seeing what sticks. And
yeah, definitely.
I know that over the years I've gone through several changes to the character or the embodiment of my account, because it's been over 3 years, and it you take on new phases every so often, just because that's what a human being is supposed to do, is to not remain stagnant, to not remain in one place following one formula. And I mean, that's been a common trait of artists throughout history. The Of course there are the more widely publicized variations and examples like that of Picasso going through the phases of cubism, and the blue phase and such.
Yeah.
But despite whatever you portray yourself as in the present, what I found is that if people want to learn more about you, they don't need to talk to you. They just need to look through your account and see how your character and your style and your emotions have changed over the course of your art in however long you've been doing such a thing. You speak for yourself subconsciously is, I think, the most valuable thing I've learned about character in creating art.
Yeah, that's a really cool idea. Definitely. I would say it's an important thing for pretty much everyone to realize also on just a personal level is that people are constantly evolving and changing. But yeah, especially as an artist, you mentioned Picasso and oh man, the name escapes me right now. Oh, Dali, where he's really famous for like the dripping clocks and the surrealist imagery. But I had this class in college where we were talking about Dali and talking about the phase of art that he put out later on in his life, where it was almost this kind of like space age depictions of Jesus's life and stuff like that. I don't know what there's a term that's used for it. I'll have to look it up. It's really cool. It's this, but it's something that like doesn't get as talked about because it's just not as famous as his other works. But the stuff that he made then, I feel like resonates with me a lot more than the dripping clocks, or because I think a lot of those images have been taken and reimagined by other artists, and so it has less meaning now. There's artwork called the Sacrament of the Last Supper, which was done in 1955. It just like his depiction of the Last Supper is really, really interesting, and it looks like a storyboard for some 60s sci-fi. It's really, yeah, I feel like it's really awesome, and in a lot of ways I feel like someone could post that now and they'd be like a vaporwave artist. So it's really cool to see how other artists have evolved, especially artists that we get told are just this certain thing, like we're given such like a snapshot of famous artists' lives, but in actuality they had so many different movements, or at least a lot of them did, of creating new and different art than we give them credit for. And I think that's helped me just appreciate like changes that I have within myself, even though I think a lot of the changes that you feel internally aren't actually as big to other people as they feel like they are to yourself. Like when you're making art, you feel like, oh man, I'm really taking a risk here. This is so different for me. But then when people listen to it, they're like, or see it, they're like, yeah, this looks like you. And you get kind of confused sometimes because you're like, oh man, I'm really going out on the edge here. I'm really changing things up, and people will look at it and I'm like, nah, that's pretty much consistent. That's
you can never defy your own expectations.
Yes, very true. The person that you were talking, is it Cultastic? When I listened to that podcast, hearing her talk about her music and her own image of her music compared to the way that it resonated or other people interacted with her music was really interesting. Where she was saying that she had all these different influences and all these songs that felt very different to her, but at the same time felt like whenever she put something out, that people kind of saw that as her music instead of being like, oh, well, this is kind of like a more dance song, this is a more witch house song,
Yeah.
It is really, I find that stuff as an artist very, very fascinating. kind of the disparity between your own vision of what you're creating and just kind of the disparity between your own vision of what you're creating and the way that that gets viewed by other people. I think that in itself is really interesting.
The designers who were part of the whole Y2K movement, I don't think that they would ever expect their designs to go on and sort of develop a second life like they have.
Definitely. I was actually just thinking about that the other day. It was just that because for me personally, a lot of influences are like package design or design in kind of like the menu screens of video games and things like that. And I was just thinking about like the fact that now that I'm living in Tokyo, just how interesting it is that a lot of the games that I played have just been designed by just regular people who probably have to this day probably have no idea how those designs and those kind of probably something that they made in just a work day have this really huge resonant effect on my life and a ton of people's lives. Also just like package designers and things like that. You know, it's just a job. You know, it's just like a day at work for them. And they probably have no idea that there's a generation of people that came up either looking at that box that they helped design the graphics for around it, or the menu design, or the sound design. Most iconically, I feel like that PS2 startup sound for me is one of the sounds. And I think about the fact of like who was it that designed that, and what do they think about that now? And do they realize like the effect? Even it's a slight effect, right? Like it's not this huge. Like I don't think about them daily, right? But it's they helped create my life in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating. But for a lot of people, it's just like a job. I don't fault them for it. I think it's it makes sense. But it's interesting that we have these movements that have kind of been created from a lot of just kind of corporate and consumerist design that wasn't meant to have this lasting impact, but it kind of does on our generation.
Right. That's one thing that I often try to explain to people. Everything in our world has to have been, or looking at every man-made object in our world, it the way, like, judging the way it was designed, looking at the time that it was designed in, whether it be a street sign or a block of apartments or a car or a plane or anything like that, just the fact that it was designed and that it was created by the human brain is a thought that fills me with confidence. And we are so diverse in the way that we portray things and design things that everything is looking to be critiqued, everything is looking to be consumed, and everything is looking to be enjoyed in one way or another.
I'd say that's something that like living in another country has made me appreciate even more. It's just kind of like some of the really basic design that we take for granted in whatever our home culture is. Whether it's like the design of a water bottle or the design of an apartment building, just the really banal, just a really mundane stuff. Looking at the design and the differences of those can be really, really exciting. I know for me, I get a lot of energy and inspiration from a lot of just really standard package design that I run into on like whenever I go to a store or a convenience store or whatever it is. Just the fact that it's like something I know, but it's just different enough that it feels like I'm in this parallel universe. And to me, it's really, really exciting. But I know like any of my Japanese coworkers or any Japanese person, I'm like, hey, look at this. This is really like fascinating and different than what I'm used to. I'll just be like, okay, yeah, but it's a water bottle, right? I think there's something really, the conversation I feel like that is a lot of art and a lot of design. And I think design gets less credit for it, but that's really what we interact with most, especially,
Mhm.
just consumerist design of whatever we're consuming. Um, it we discredit it a lot because it's just meant to get us to buy the next thing, but we interact with it so much. It's
My bad.
that's probably a bigger influence than we realize than a lot of the major artists that we look up to. I think that's a nice thing about kind of this wave of Y2K inspired art. It is probably more so than ever, probably just because of the way that the late 90s and early 2000s were. Consumerist culture was kind of at its peak, I feel like, and kind of the big corporations had won. The empire had defeated the rebels at that point. It was we have a lot of really great consumerist art to look at. The Max Martin music and the random products that we got as kids that we were so excited about.
Quite interesting in like 200, 300 years when we have evolved on to have another purpose, to look back on the era of consumerism and the art that it created and the philosophies of the time that instilled by it. Like you were saying, around Y2K, that was really the peak of consumerist culture, I would say.
Yeah.
And slowly you're starting to see, as we work our way into the 21st century, we're entering a bit of a post-consumerist culture. It's not working like it used to because corporations are trying the same tactics to sell their products, and people aren't buying at the capacity that they used to. One of the most prevalent areas of that is the box office, is that people aren't going to see movies as much anymore just because it's not as interesting, because we kind of bled that art form to death on a corporate level.
I will say I definitely still love a lot of blockbusters, but yeah, it's interesting too that a lot of the big producers of movies, and rather than like really update the form, they're kind of just shifting to other markets. Like it's easier to continue doing what producing the same stuff that you're making and selling it to people who are less immune to it now than it is to just actually kind of reinvent what you were creating. See that a lot with like a lot of movies now where we think they're flops in America, but when you look at the box office in China, for example, it's like the movie, like we're like, why did some of these movies get a sequel? They didn't do well at all. We're so used to that kind of like America-centric model for entertainment. And the fact of the matter is that they sold a lot of tickets in China, so they're gonna keep making more of it, whether Americans liked it or not.
I think that's representative of the emerging cultures of the East and the sort of way that Western cultures have aged past that era of consumerist prevalence.
Yeah,
It's just a differentiation in the speed at which cultures develop, and we, having occupied sort of a different sector in America or in the majority of the West, thinking that the internet is the only place to be on the cutting edge. And you look over in China, and the movie market is still a very expansive and booming industry. It's just how and when countries have developed to that point of consumerist prevalence.
yeah, that's one thing that's been interesting living here is that like the Japanese consumer probably on average is way less jaded than in the U.S. So certain things that would fly here just like would totally get shot down. I think I mean, you know, Japan is pretty unique in a lot of ways, but it is really interesting to see like a lot of people will buy into a lot of the like promotions and things that would get off at and you know just ignored in the US. It still has an effect here. And a lot of the kind of I say traditional, obviously, I'm sure an older person would say that it's modern marketing, but kind of like a lot of the traditional marketing streams and ways that things are promoted here are done in a much less jaded, much more idealistic way that I feel like in the US, you know, for example, we have like the Wendy's account that's like negging other social media accounts and stuff like that. I think I'm probably patting American consumerism on the back too much, but I think we've avoided ways largely by necessity because Americans get jaded so quickly. But like, I can't imagine that happening in Japan.
Right.
It's just not necessary, you know.
At this point, at least. At this point.
Yeah, for sure. At this point, right?
Because everything is subject to change and evolution.
Oh yeah. Like
American.
I think Japan might get there. It'll just get there different,
American,
you know.
Because American advertising used to be a lot more idealistic and representative of a more perfect vision of what it should be. And slowly, after time gets behind it, you see America get more jaded. And you'll see that, I think you'll see all the emerging market consumers culture.
Yeah. I think that's the thing that's interesting about Japan, though. It's just that it's not really like an emerging market because it came up.
It's been prevalent for a while.
Yeah. And they had a economic downturn, and then you know they kind of crawled back. I don't think they're really where they used to be, but I think that like as far as developed countries in East Asia go, it's they kind of have their established way of doing things, and it's not like China, for example, where it's kind of the Wild West and they're trying to come up for how to make things work, how to make marketing work, and learn more their consumers. Here, it's already kind of been established for a while. And they have their set way of doing things. It's just interesting that I feel like people here are less immune to a lot of the what we would consider more like traditional marketing. But it's not, and then that's not to say anything about Japan, because as a weeb I would never do that. But also, I think that it's just the way that Japanese culture is.
Right.
It's kind of on a very different trajectory. The way that here has evolved here is just going to be different, and it is different already.
Thank God for that. You know, you don't want every you don't want every country to follow in the footsteps of America and become so jaded and bloated.
Yeah, that is something. Being out of America, I think you do realize like how quickly America culturally we have such a short attention span compared to other countries. We are so quick to get rid of genres and forms of music that we're like, oh man, this is like 5 years too old. We're not going to make this anymore. Whereas there's like a lot of like progressive rock groups here in Japan that are doing just fine, and there's still a scene that supports it. In the U.S., it's like
hasn't been popular since the 70s.
Yeah, right. Like it's just really interesting to see that, because it makes you reflect on your own culture and go like, oh man, like I guess I was the problem, right? You just become more critical of where you lived, and I think more than anything, I'm just really fascinated and interested in why America in particular. Not that we're special in any way, but I just feel like our pop culture moves at such an accelerated rate. And I just wonder, like, what led to that? What led to it going at such an insane speed? And it's not that like culture's getting better. I don't want to make it sound like we're light years ahead of other cultures, because I don't feel that way. But I feel like our pop music changes flavors so quickly.
Yeah. That
and I don't think that's a good thing, because I think scenes can't really form properly, and I think it makes less good art because you don't have enough time to really sit and reflect on what's being created. And maybe that's by design, is that we don't have enough time to really be critical of what we're consuming, and just on to the next thing.
That is a wonderful topic to dig into, but unfortunately, I will have to take my leave.
Oh, no worries.
It's a wonderful discussion with you, gentlemen. Have a good evening.
Thanks for coming on.
In regards to American pop culture right now, really seen, if you Twitter, any social media, that new Cats movie that really
Yeah, I've seen some buzz about it. I'm not super familiar. Actually, it's been kind of nice being here, because contrary to a lot of like our views of Japan, where we, at least back in the day, people felt like Japan really worshipped American pop culture. I don't feel like that's largely true. I feel like Japan largely ignores most American pop culture. This is something that became more apparent when I moved here. I have no idea what's popular right now as far as music goes for the US. And so I did see a critique of the trailer, or whatever it was, the kind of preview for Cats. Some people talking about it, but I'm not super familiar with even the source material, the original Cats.
Interesting thing to me was just the immediate pushback from that trailer. The only thing I can think that is close to that would be the Sonic live action movie that they teased.
Yeah, it's been a bad couple of years for
my lifetime.
Oh yeah, it's really it's interesting. Talking about the Sonic movie, that they actually changed. That's fascinating. I feel like largely this day and age, it feels like you're so powerless sometimes as and as a regular person. You're not having the effects, but it's interesting to see like that pushback on Sonic, for example, where they actually chose to change it because it was such a strong pushback. It's kind of cool. It doesn't necessarily feel like democracy.
Yeah, man, you have to wonder if this was just a publicity stunt. I feel sorry for the poor animators that now have to go back, work overtime to fix this mistake.
Oh man, yeah, no, but like I think our skepticism to even the fact that was really even meant to be the final design, or whether they just wanted more buzz. I feel like that's such a it's an interesting reaction for us to have, but it just shows how jaded we are. It's kind of like we've become so skeptical. And I was actually doing the same thing just recently, where you probably, I hope for your own sake you haven't heard too much about this, but the whole kimono, Kim Kardashian making I don't know, is it a lingerie, or trying to trademark the word kimono? Like the mayor of Kyoto wrote her like a heartfelt letter, like asking her to like stop doing that, the appropriation, and then kind of the sullying the kind of beautiful cultural tradition of Japan for like a marketing thing. My reaction was just like, this can't be real. Like, this has to be just a thing to get buzz, And I don't know if that's unique to America, or just maybe like a generational thing, but I do feel like we're constantly questioning whether things are real now, more often than I'd like them to be. that seems to be the case, where things are just, there's buzz around a certain thing or a certain controversy for reasons that don't necessarily to be there. And often it's a fit the companies behind them instead of cause any real meaningful social change.
And I think on the topic of corporate manipulation, you look at clickbait journalism, people are very quick to rush to judgment against the authors of these pieces. And I'm not saying that clickbait journalism is good, but I do feel like we direct a lot of our outrage at the wrong people. It's the people at the top that basically tell everyone, look, if you want to make money, you gotta publish this. You gotta, act in this way. It's controversial because it will gain you notoriety or influence.
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely, I mean, we often I think this is just humanity in general, but we're often willing to attack the server at a fast food restaurant, or the cashier at a grocery store, than the actual corporation behind it. And I find hope in the fact that I think subsequent generations are getting more wise to that. I really do it with clickbait journalism. I actually, someone that I went to high school, they write articles for CNN, and the thing they do is actually journalism. It's not just clickbait, but so much of that whole medium has been kind of tainted by the BuzzFeedification of a lot of news that I think. Also, I think it's just it's unfair for us to kind of knock these interns or entry level employees when it's not them really making the decision to put out 5 listicles a day. It's rotting from the head down. So as someone who has been in marketing, I feel like I do sympathize for the people writing those articles.
Shifting gears a little bit, your edits often incorporate qualities I associate with video game art. And is there a particular video game that you'd say has influenced your art style?
Yeah, the biggest video games probably for me. One of them was one I didn't even actually play, but I just watched my friend playing for hours at a time, which was Final Fantasy X. That was a big one. Just kind of the blend. I think Final Fantasy, especially during that era, and I'd say even to this day with 15 and stuff, did a really good job of blending technology and magic in a way that felt really beautiful and inspiring. And so that was a big thing. I think I do it a little bit less now, but earlier I did more things, and we're kind of blending technology and magic. I think there's something very beautiful about that. But additionally, some games that influenced me, I'd say the top 2 are maybe less beloved than I feel like they deserve to be. But if you've ever heard of Phantom Crash, which is a game on the Xbox, it's like a mech battle game where you create and customize your own battle mech, and then it's set in Neo Tokyo in the future. I forget if it's destroyed or just run down, and so they've sectioned off part of Tokyo for mech battles, which is kind of a classic setting, I guess. But just something about the setting, the aesthetic of it, the characters that they put in the game. There's a lot of text to dialogue between the different. There's something about that game that when I was younger really captured my imagination, and it's kind of in some ways feels kind of dystopian and post-apocalyptic, but at the same time there's a lot of bright colors and positivity and kind of this, as I was talking about earlier, like kind of counterculture feeling that I feel like a lot of late 90s and early 2000s when this game was developed, probably like Greece game, kind of a rejection of the traditional path in life to kind of pursue your own dreams, pursue adventure. I just feel like we're really, really cool, and I don't feel like it gets much credit at all. Maybe there's like some sort of like cult following. I'm sure there's got to be online. I have not connected with them, but I would love to because there's so many parts of this game that are really cool. One of the really cool parts is that there's like a record shop in the game, and so the game has all these professional tracks and tracks from just probably, I imagine, maybe just small Japanese artists at the time. And part of it is that you can purchase these tracks, and then you can buy music and then create a playlist for when you're battling, which is just like a really cool concept to add into like a game that really I don't feel like got much hype around it. And then of course you can like customize your mech and get different like patterns and paint designs on your mech. It's kind of like Armored Core, which I think is definitely a more popular series, but this one feels a little more alternative and a little more lighthearted, and it's a really fun game that I feel like most of my contemporaries haven't played, but they really should. If you can ever find a way to play it, I don't think many people have an original Xbox these days. That game when I was a kid was a really cool, and I think it definitely laid a lot of foundations for kind of the not only the aesthetic but also the attitude and the perspective that I try to tackle a lot of my projects with.
And actually, a friend of the podcast, Milo, aka Connection 2000, he recently bought an Xbox, so I'm definitely gonna tell him about this. He would love to check it out.
Yeah, that's like my number one game recommendation. I don't play as many video games now as I used to when I was younger. When I was younger, I definitely used it as an escape. The other Xbox game that I'd say is really great is Jet Set Radio Future. Again, like set in like a futuristic Tokyo, a lot of bright colors and a lot of kind of like it's very lighthearted. If anyone's played the original Jet Set, which I think is more popular, Jet Set Radio, I feel like there's a lot of similar inspiration because in that game there's a lot of in-game music that's done by like individual artists group. I think there was even like a DJ that they had make a lot of tracks for it. I had my brother for my birthday a few years back gave me the soundtrack of that game. It's wild. It's really interesting. I feel like disco and funk samples and just like a lot of really weird influences to that music.
Yeah, and I mean, like the Jet Set Radio has definitely, I think, been influential with animators and designers. I mean, it's just a really iconic game. Speaking on the music front, because I know that you also make music, and I'm curious, do you have like a SoundCloud or a Bandcamp, or is it strictly just with your visuals?
So that's something that I would like to change in the near future, which I've been saying for a while. All the music that I make are just clips that go with my visuals, and part of that was shortly after getting reached out to by Virtual Self to do some stuff for them to use in their live show. I realized that I wanted to, or that it was more effective to have music going with the visuals that I was making, and so I've been making music for a really long time, but it's always kind of been a hobby, and I've made a lot of different types of music past, I was part of a pop punk, and then a screamo group after that. Neither influenced me much as far as like the sounds that I create, but that was kind of my first, or one of my first avenues into making music, realizing that I could actually just use a program to create music. That was really influential for me. Yeah, as far as like musical influences, or actually, I guess to answer your original question, right? Do I have a SoundCloud? I don't, and I actually get stressed out when people ask me, because I get a decent amount of requests for me to make a SoundCloud, and I'm kind of a perfectionist, and everything that I make I feel like is not good enough to be a final track, and so I'm not ready to like release anything. But I've been meaning to at least release like one single soon. But I've been saying that for about a year, so we'll see if it happens. I'd like to make a SoundCloud. It's one of those things where you want it to be. I feel like I have no business like adding to the noise that is SoundCloud if I don't have something that feels kind of new. And a lot of the stuff that I make is definitely inspired by other music. I'm not bringing enough new to the table that makes me want to put sounds out yet. And when I make, if and when I make a song to release on SoundCloud, or maybe like people have also asked me to do like a DJ set or something like that, where I mix in my different melodies and tracks that I've posted with my visuals. I want whatever I do to feel like it's bringing something new to the table instead of just rehashing a lot of the musical influences that I had from being young.
I think that the little snippets and stuff on Instagram, I think, are enough to at least open SoundCloud or Camp, and just kind of put that stuff out there and see how people react to it. Because I mean, personally, I really love it, and I think
well, thank you. I really appreciate that. I was actually like, I tend to be like pretty insecure, or
I mean, we all are as artists.
Degrade myself internally. So it's always it feels very validating and very good to hear that people like what I make. And it always kind of boosts myself when someone comments and goes like, "Oh wow, you should really like start a SoundCloud." I know a lot of for me, like creating a SoundCloud and then finishing a track, it's kind of become a bit of like psychosis of
Yeah,
it's been so long since I've put anything out that I have this feeling that whatever I put out has to be absolute, because it's like my new first impression. I was talking with this person who was talking about why they don't post on social media anymore. This is just like their personal account, like pictures of their day-to-day life. And I was talking with a group of people, and we were all talking to this guy, and he was like, "Oh, I don't post anything because it's been so long since I posted, and I feel like whatever I post next has to be like really important." And I think it doesn't make sense to do that. At the same time, I very much buy into that feeling of like, it's been so long since I've posted any music. I need to make sure whatever I put out next is absolutely perfect. I know that's a moving target. I know that that's not sustainable if I actually want to ever put something out, because I've been saying for at least the past year. So we'll see if I can get past. Maybe I need to hire a therapist. but yeah, I would really love to. I think that there's something in making art and stuff and posting things. It's very fulfilling about interacting with people and enjoying the conversation that is just kind of creating. So to have another medium to do that, I would really love that. Also, to have something that's longer than 15 minutes to add visuals to, or not 15 minutes, 15 seconds. Making more than 15 seconds of visuals every time is something I look forward to doing. Yeah, I need to get on that. It's just kind of intimidating, I guess. A long story short, TLDR, it's intimidating, so I haven't yet.
Keep working on it. I'm always curious to see what new stuff you have. Since you mentioned Porter Robinson, I have to ask, are you familiar with DVI Caputo? I know he did some work for Porter Robinson as well. Are you familiar with him?
He lives in Tokyo too, I think. I reached out to him earlier this year, and I was like, we should get together because I just wanted to like hear about what his process is, what he uses, and what he does. He seems like the stuff that he makes, both musically and visually, are really really cool. And I feel like much more fully than what I'm capable of capture that Y2K aesthetic, and it feels like you're playing like an arcade game in a Japanese arcade every time you listen or look at anything that he posts. I've been meaning to meet with him. I reached out to him, and then we both got busy, and I was like, maybe we can reconnect in like, I want to say maybe like March or May or something like that. And but it is something I would really love to meet, because for me, he's like a celebrity artist that I would love to meet face. He does really really cool stuff. Some people have asked me if I'm like influenced by virtual self, and in some ways I'm kind of inspired by some of the stuff that was released on the album, but I feel like more than just Porter Robinson and virtual self, the artists behind that project are really really cool and really interesting to look into. So I really...
Are there other kind of designers that you can think of offhand that kind of influence you?
The inspiration that I get for what I do comes from things where it's not actually like an artist, right? It's someone in some design firm working for a corporation or something that's producing some product. There's quite a few people, especially on Instagram, that I think are really cool. There's someone called Glitch Mood, done work for Slater and quite a few other people. I think they're based in the UK, I would imagine. I think the stuff that they make is really, really cool. And I love how everything's this feels very glossy, dream blur diffusion over every image. A lot of the visual art that accompanies like Hannah Diamond and AJ Cook and Danielle Harl are things that I don't, unfortunately, I don't know the particular artist that worked on each of those things, which is my own laziness and fault. But stuff that they make really, really cool. At least to me, feels like the future or pointing towards something that feels new. Another thing, which this doesn't make much, you wouldn't probably see this from a lot of the designs that I post, but recently I've been really fascinated by kind of black metal logos, the philosophy of them, if that makes sense. The fact that they're meant to be, it's kind of like the equivalent of using like Unicode in your artist name to make you forever obscure, Witch House, stuff like that did back in the day. I think visually, a lot of like groups like that, where they have these band logos that are completely illegible. It just looks like a like bundle of thorns or something. Like it doesn't look like it's supposed to be read. It just looks like it's supposed to be looked at. Like moving forward, that's something that I'd like to have more influence on what I do, because I just think it's just the act of doing that is very counterintuitive, and also aesthetically, just looking at it, it's very interesting. I think pairing that also with like pastels and kind of a glossy blur over it, it's a really cool concept, which I'd like to explore more.
And I feel like what I was talking about earlier with you about Dave Ednick, I think his design really kind of embodies a lot of what you're talking about, where it's not meant necessarily that the text is so and altered, and it's a really interesting look for sure.
Yeah, I think I don't know what the source of that is. I'd be really curious to learn what originally inspired that. But I think, you know, part of it grows out of the immunity that a lot of people in the West have to advertising. You want someone to stop and really try to decipher what they're looking at. But I'd be really interested to see origins of that. I would imagine, just based on the aesthetics of a lot of the stuff that he seems to put out, or they seem to put out, I would imagine it's from like kind of rave posters or something like that.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. I really enjoyed talking with you, LILIKOI. And I think it goes without saying that we'd love to have you back on with another guest.
Yeah, I would love to be a part of anything that you guys have coming up.
Yeah, I'll keep you up to date. Sometimes this stuff kind of pops off last minute too. So, but
Yeah,
of
yeah.
course, I know a little bit about your schedule now, so I'll keep that.
Yeah.
So, is there any person you'd like to shout out? Would you like to mention your social media, all that, before we close things?
Yeah, sure. Shouting out myself, it's at LILIKOI.WAV. LILIKOI is LILIKOI period WAV. LILIKOI actually comes from the Hawaiian word for passion fruit, by the way. I was born in Hawaii, so that's where that comes from. As far as like other artists, again, gotta say, Glitch Mood has been very kind to me online. DVI, Caputo, also. Um, there's a lot of people that I worked with too infrequently, but those two definitely come to mind as people. If you're interested in the stuff that I do, check them out too. They do really much better than I do. So
Yeah, well, I think you're doing pretty good for yourself too.
too kind.
Yeah, no. Your stuff is really great, really inspiring. It's been fun. Look forward to seeing you in the future.
All right, sounds good. Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's been fun talking.
This has been the World Movers Media Podcast with your host, DJ Angelfire. The next episode.